The plane was already boarding when the young man walked through the gate. Calm, unhurried, dressed in a simple white shirt and brown slacks that had been neatly pressed but carried no signs of wealth or status. He had no entourage, no security detail, no designer luggage, just a leather satchel slung over his shoulder and an air of quiet dignity. Most of the passengers didn't give him a second glance. Why would they? To them, he looked like just another traveler on a long-haul flight out of West Africa. But in truth, he was anything but ordinary. His name was Ibrahim Traoré, though only a few in the world would have recognized him out of uniform. And fewer still would have guessed that he was one of the most powerful and respected presidents on the African continent. It had started off as just another routine flight. The airport buzzed with the usual mix of tired families, business travelers tapping on their phones, and children dragging stuffed animals through security lines. The airline staff were moving quickly, trying to stay on schedule. The flight attendants were polite but clearly exhausted. Somewhere between the chaos of boarding and the closing of the aircraft doors, something subtle shifted in the atmosphere. Something almost invisible, but it would shape everything that followed. When Ibrahim stepped into the business class cabin, he offered a small nod to the attendant standing by the entrance. She barely looked up. He moved to take his seat quietly, but the moment his boarding pass flashed across the scanner, a frown crept onto the attendant's face. "This seat is reserved," she said curtly, her tone sharp, without looking directly at him. Ibrahim paused, gently correcting her. "I believe this is my seat." She snatched the boarding pass from his hand, her eyebrows arching as she read it. Without apology, she handed it back. "Fine. Just take your seat quickly, we're already late." The passengers around him glanced up briefly, then looked away. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew they were witnessing a moment they would one day tell stories about. But for now, it was just another man being brushed aside, treated like someone who didn't quite belong. The tension grew slowly, like a storm cloud on the horizon. A few more small slights, delays in serving him water, a dismissive tone when he asked for a blanket. His meal arriving much later than others. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make headlines on its own. But enough to feel undeniable and deliberate. The flight attendant's expression never softened. If anything, her attitude hardened every time she passed his row. It wasn't clear why. Maybe it was the simplicity of his clothes. Maybe it was his soft-spoken manner. Or maybe it was something deeper, an unconscious assumption that a man like him didn't deserve to be sitting in a premium seat. Ibrahim remained composed throughout, never raising his voice, never demanding attention. He thanked her each time she passed, even when her eyes barely met his. He sat straight, looking out the window as the clouds drifted by, the light from the sky catching the edge of his expression, a mixture of patience and something deeper. Perhaps he'd seen this before. Perhaps he knew how the world worked, how people judged worth by appearance. Or perhaps he had simply learned to endure it. But not everyone was blind. Seated 2 rows behind him was an older gentleman, an African scholar who had once lectured at universities across Europe. The man stared at Ibrahim for a long time, squinting, puzzled. There was something familiar about that face. The way he carried himself. The eyes steady and focused. It couldn't be, he thought. What would President Ibrahim Traoré be doing here, alone, with no security, no announcement, no attention? But the resemblance was striking. The scholar leaned toward the man beside him and whispered, "I think that's President Traoré." The other man blinked. "Are you sure?" "No, but I have a feeling." The whisper traveled like a quiet ripple through the cabin, from row to row. I started turning. Subtle glances, then longer stares. A few people discreetly pulled out their phones to check online images. And as more passengers began to recognize him, the mood in the cabin began to shift. Curiosity turning to disbelief, disbelief into embarrassment. And yet, the flight attendant still hadn't noticed. She was too busy preparing trays, too absorbed in her own assumptions to realize who she had been ignoring. She didn't see the soft murmurs growing around her. She didn't notice the older man quietly rise from his seat and walk toward Ibrahim, lowering his head in respect before gently asking, "Mr. President, is it really you?" Ibrahim looked up and smiled politely. He didn't confirm it aloud. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was answer enough. All at once, everything changed. The flight attendant froze in place, tray in hand. Her mouth opened slightly, her eyes wide. You could see the color drain from her face as realization struck. She had spent hours showing quiet disrespect to a man many considered a hero in his country, a leader who had chosen to stand with his people when others fled, who rose not through wealth or privilege, but through grit, service, and sacrifice. For a moment no one spoke. The silence on board was so sharp, it felt like the plane had stopped moving. And as she slowly stepped forward, her lips trembling, trying to form the beginning of an apology, Ibrahim did something unexpected. He stood up. Not angrily, not to confront, but with the same quiet strength he'd carried throughout the entire flight. He adjusted his jacket and looked at her calmly, as if seeing not just her mistake, but her humanity too. What he said next left the entire cabin breathless. But before those words could settle, the captain's voice came over the speaker, calling for someone from the airline crew to come to the cockpit immediately. Something was happening, something unexpected. And it had nothing to do with first-class meals or seat numbers. The real story was only just beginning. Ibrahim stood motionless for a few seconds after the captain's voice faded. The calm in his eyes never wavered, even as everyone around him buzzed with curiosity, confusion, and now a hint of fear. The flight attendant who had dismissed him just minutes earlier was now clutching her hands together, unsure whether to speak or move. Her posture changed completely, her shoulders no longer stiff with authority, but slumped with silent regret. Still, Ibrahim didn't say a word. He offered her a nod, not harsh, not bitter, just quiet, forgiving even. But behind that silence, something deeper stirred. The passengers could sense it. They knew they were in the middle of something they didn't quite understand yet. Then, slowly, Ibrahim returned to his seat as the plane glided smoothly above the clouds. The older gentleman remained standing beside him for a moment, offering one more respectful bow before stepping away. The cabin grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Heavy, aware. I shifted nervously. Conversations resumed, but only in whispers. The flight crew exchanged looks. The name Ibrahim Traoré was now spreading across the cabin like smoke, soft but impossible to ignore. Back in the cockpit, something else was happening. The captain, a Frenchman with nearly 25 years of flight experience, was staring at his co-pilot. He had just received a coded message through the secure aviation system, something he hadn't seen in years. It mentioned a high-value passenger on board. No name. Just a security-level tag that meant, observe protocol, do not engage, and avoid disruption. Whoever this passenger was, they were traveling without public knowledge. Protected identity. The co-pilot tapped the screen nervously. This came just now. We didn't have this on the manifest. The captain frowned. Why wasn't this flagged during boarding? Someone wanted it quiet. Very quiet. The captain leaned back, processing. Find out which seat. Quietly. As the cockpit crew began their subtle investigation, back in the cabin, Ibrahim sat quietly, staring out the window again. But his mind was far from the peaceful clouds. Somewhere deep inside he was thinking. Remembering. Not about the flight attendant's behavior. That didn't trouble him. He'd faced worse in uniform. But something else. Something about the timing of this flight. Something about the meeting he was headed to. Few people knew that this wasn't just a routine journey. Ibrahim was on his way to a discreet international conference, an emergency summit involving key African leaders. Not publicized. Not televised. The goal was to quietly discuss strategies for handling rising tensions in West Africa. Threats were growing. Not just political but underground networks involving arms exploitation and foreign manipulation. A storm was brewing behind the scenes, And Ibrahim was at the heart of it. Not by choice but by duty. That's why he had chosen to fly alone. No motorcade. No national flag on the tail. No interviews. He needed to move quietly without drawing attention, to meet a handful of trusted allies in a private location. But someone must have known. Someone must have seen through the layers of silence surrounding his trip. That message to the cockpit, that wasn't random. It meant someone was watching. And not everyone watching wanted him safe. From the back of the plane, a man wearing sunglasses and a dark cap rose from his seat and walked down the aisle, pretending to stretch. His movements were casual but too controlled. He glanced at Ibrahim's row as he passed, just a second too long, then moved toward the galley. The flight attendant noticed, blinking slowly. She didn't know who the man was. She hadn't seen him board. Something about him didn't feel right. Ibrahim noticed, too. His fingers twitched slightly, a subtle reflex from his time in the military. The way the man moved. The way he scanned the rows. It wasn't curiosity. It was training. He'd seen that look before. The mystery deepened. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, this time smoother, but with an edge beneath the words. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be adjusting our flight path slightly due to weather. Nothing to worry about. Please remain seated. It wasn't the weather. Ibrahim knew that tone. The captain had been warned, told to change course, either for safety or something more. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. The stakes were rising. He could feel it. Behind him, whispers had grown louder. Passengers were beginning to talk openly now, a mix of admiration and disbelief. That's him, I'm telling you. Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso. What's he doing on this flight? I read he never travels with guards. He's different. People love him because he walks among them. But why wouldn't the airline know he was on board? All valid questions, and none of them had easy answers. The truth was, Ibrahim didn't like traveling with a crowd. It reminded him too much of the politics he didn't care for. He preferred action, simplicity, and being close to people. But today that choice might come at a cost. The man in the cap returned to his seat, but only briefly. He leaned toward a woman beside him, whispered something in her ear, and she nodded. Then she reached into her purse, adjusting something inside. A faint clicking sound followed, quick, soft, but not unnoticed. Ibrahim didn't turn his head. He simply blinked, steadying his breath. He didn't want to alarm the other passengers. Not yet. But he knew now, he wasn't just being watched. Someone was testing him. Or worse, planning something. The flight that had started with small disrespect was now becoming a flight of shadows, secrets, and unknown threats. In the galley, the flight attendant who had treated him coldly earlier was pacing. She had overheard part of the whispers. She now realized she had shown disrespect not just to a passenger, but to a head of state. And yet, guilt wasn't her only emotion. Fear had started to creep in. She had seen the man in the cap too. And the woman. She had worked hundreds of flights. Something about this one didn't feel normal. She finally turned to one of her fellow crew members and whispered, "We might have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "I think there's more going on than just a VIP passenger. Something's not right." Back in his seat, Ibrahim slowly reached into his satchel and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. Inside were codes, contacts, and a list of names. Some allies, some not. He flipped to the last page. A name was circled there. One he didn't expect to see connected to this trip. Someone who had everything to lose if this summit happened. And everything to gain if he didn't make it. Outside, the plane cruised smoothly through the upper atmosphere. But inside, the cabin felt like it was slowly tightening, like a string being pulled at both ends. And just as the tension reached its peak, a soft beep echoed through the cabin. An alert. Call button had been pressed. But it wasn't from a passenger. Came from the cockpit. The soft beep lingered in the air like a breath held too long. Everyone heard it, but most passengers didn't think twice. Just another routine call from the cockpit, maybe for water or assistance. But to Ibrahim, and to the few now quietly paying attention to the strange rhythm of the flight, it was a signal. Not random. Not harmless. The head flight attendant, a middle-aged man named Claude, stiffened the moment the beep echoed. His training kicked in. The cockpit had a private call system, used rarely and only in specific situations. If the pilots used it instead of speaking over the intercom, it meant something sensitive was happening. Claude looked toward the galley, nodded at the young woman who'd been pacing earlier, and excused himself. When he entered the cockpit moments later, the door shut with a soft but definitive click. Inside, the captain looked pale. He gestured toward the screen, where a live message thread had opened from Aviation Security Command. The latest message read, "Confirmed identity, President Traoré on board. Undisclosed threat possible. Follow red level silent protocol." Claude read the message, blinked, then slowly exhaled. Why weren't we told during boarding? The captain shook his head. Someone wanted him hidden, probably to avoid drawing attention. But now, he pointed to the radar, where a blip had appeared slightly off their intended path. We're being asked to reroute, and they haven't explained why. Claude looked back toward the cabin. So we've got one of Africa's most important leaders, a possible threat, and rerouting orders without explanation. Yes. And they want us to keep everyone calm. Claude was silent. Then he said something that chilled the room. I think someone on this plane is here for him. Back in the cabin, the woman with the purse hadn't moved since the click. She sat calmly, eyes closed as if sleeping. But her body was too still, too controlled. Ibrahim had noticed the way her hands moved earlier. Subtle, efficient. Not like someone adjusting sunglasses or makeup. She was doing something. Communicating, perhaps. Or preparing. Meanwhile, the man in the cap had taken out a book, pretending to read. But the pages never turned. And every few minutes, his eyes flicked forward, always in Ibrahim's direction. In seat 22B, near the rear of the plane, a teenage boy named Kofi sat beside his mother. They had boarded quietly, unnoticed. Kofi was traveling for the first time. His wide eyes glued to the window earlier in the flight. But now he sensed something. Kids pick up on things adults often ignore. He leaned toward his mother and whispered, "Why does everyone keep looking at that man up front?" His mother hushed him, smiling gently. "He's someone important, I think. Maybe a politician. But why does he look so alone?" Kofi asked. The question hung in the air. His mother had no answer. Meanwhile, a subplot was unfolding in the crew quarters. One of the junior flight attendants, Marcus, had overheard the word president earlier and had been discreetly checking online. When he confirmed who Ibrahim Traoré was, he quickly typed a message to his brother, an activist back home in Senegal. "He's on my flight. Right now. Alone." But before he could hit send, the network cut out. Wi-Fi was down. He tried again. Nothing. In the cockpit, the co-pilot had quietly flipped the switch that disabled passenger internet. Standard protocol when silent rerouting is initiated. But to passengers like Marcus, it only added to the growing sense that something wasn't right. Ibrahim closed his notebook. He could feel the eyes on him now. Not just curious ones, but calculated ones. He glanced subtly at the emergency exit row, noted the people seated there, then returned his gaze to the window. His mind was turning. If there was a plan to intercept him, or worse, it wouldn't happen in the air. It would happen upon landing. But if the crew was rerouting without explanation, maybe the threat was already closer than he thought. Another ripple passed through the cabin. This time it came from the front, where a passenger, a well-dressed businessman, stood up and walked to the lavatory. But instead of entering, he bent down and adjusted something beneath the seat in the bulkhead. A sharp-eyed passenger across the aisle caught the movement and frowned. Nothing dramatic but strange enough. She tapped her husband gently. "Did you see that?" "See what?" "That man just did something near the floor." "Think." I think he hid something. Back in the galley, the female attendant who had mistreated Ibrahim earlier was now watching everything carefully. Her earlier guilt had transformed into concern. She replayed her interactions with the suspicious passengers in her mind. The man in the cap, the quiet woman, and now the businessman. Pattern was forming. She pulled out her tablet, opened the seating chart, and started marking quietly. She tapped each of them color-coded. Then she glanced at Ibrahim's row and whispered, "This wasn't an accident." Meanwhile, in the cargo hold, unseen by all, a crate marked diplomatic was slightly ajar. It had passed inspection before takeoff, supposedly sealed by embassy clearance. But no one had checked it after boarding. No one dared break protocol. But inside that crate wasn't just diplomatic cargo. Something else had been placed within it. Something with tracking equipment. Something that didn't belong to any embassy. And whoever had put it there was watching from elsewhere. The flight continued, smooth as glass, but beneath that calm was a tightening grip. Every steward, every glance, every sudden movement felt heavier now. Passengers sensed the tension, even if they couldn't name it. Ibrahim finally turned his gaze from the clouds and picked up the in-flight magazine, flipping it slowly. To most, it would look like he was casually reading. But behind the glossy pages, he was watching the aisle, memorizing faces, patterns, movement. And then it happened. A slight jolt, just a bump, passed through the plane. Barely noticeable, but enough for the captain to chime in again. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are passing through a brief turbulence pocket." It wasn't turbulence. Because in the cockpit, the alert system had blinked red. Unauthorized signal detected. Someone had activated a communication device from within the plane. Ibrahim's fingers curled around the magazine's edge. His instinct screamed. He knew now. The conflict wasn't waiting for him on the ground. It had already boarded. The question was, how many were involved? And what did they want from him? The answer would have to wait. The light over the seatbelt sign blinked again, followed by the captain's voice, calmer than before, but anyone really listening could hear the tension underneath. "Please stay seated as we continue through mild turbulence." His voice cut off quickly, a little too quickly. Passengers looked at each other with uneasy glances. Whatever was happening wasn't just about turbulence. Something was wrong. Ibrahim felt it in his bones. The small vibration that traveled through the floor wasn't the kind of shake you feel from wind. It was too localized, too brief. Something electronic. Someone on board had triggered a device, possibly signaling someone outside the plane. Or worse, activating something within. His mind scanned possibilities, his fingers twitching again. He shifted slightly in his seat, just enough to slide his satchel closer to his feet. The woman across the aisle, the one with the calm face and the still hands, opened her eyes. For the first time since she'd boarded, she looked directly at Ibrahim. Their eyes met. She didn't blink. Neither did he. It was a quiet exchange, but full of unspoken tension. She knew that he knew. And now the air between them felt like a wire pulled tight, just waiting to snap. Behind them, the man with the cap leaned forward, as if stretching. His hand brushed against the bottom of the seat in front of him, fingers pressing lightly against the cushion before pulling away. It was subtle, almost nothing. But Ibrahim caught the movement in his peripheral vision. That was the third signal. The first was the glance. The second was the woman's click. The third was the man's hand placement. 3 signals. Coordinated. Silent. Trained. Ibrahim's throat tightened. He had faced threats before, even under fire, but never like this. Surrounded by civilians, 30,000 feet in the air, with no clear way out. Whatever this was, it had been planned with precision. No weapons, no shouting. Just shadows and signals. In the cockpit, Claude had returned, pale and visibly shaken. "Captain," he whispered, "we need to land. Now." The captain didn't take his eyes off the instruments. "We've been given clearance to reroute to a private airfield near the border. But command is being vague. They won't tell us why." Claude lowered his voice. I think the president is in danger. And I think someone on this plane is waiting for us to land. The co-pilot turned, alarmed. You think they're here to take him? Or worse, Claude said. This isn't just political. This is personal. Back in the cabin, passengers were starting to notice the growing tension among the crew. One of the mothers in the back whispered to another woman. Do you feel that? Like something's not being said. A businessman clutched his phone, trying to refresh a news page, but the Wi-Fi was still disabled. Another passenger tried to stand, but a flight attendant gently urged him back to his seat. Smiles were tight. Eyes moved quickly. Politeness was wearing thin. And in row 3, Ibrahim calmly unzipped his satchel. Inside wasn't anything threatening, just a small notebook, a pen, and a folded letter. He removed the letter, glanced at it briefly, then slid it into his coat pocket. It wasn't the content that mattered. It was the symbol printed in wax on the edge. Private seal. One that only a few trusted allies would recognize. If something happened to him on this flight, that letter would explain everything. But he wasn't ready to give up yet. He watched as the man with the cap stood again and began moving toward the rear of the plane. On the surface, it looked like he was heading for the restroom. But Ibrahim noticed something. He didn't walk like a man about to use the toilet. He walked like a scout checking his angles. Slow, deliberate steps, careful glances, and one hand always near his side. The woman stood up next. And at that moment, everything in Ibrahim's body told him. It's starting. He rose slowly, prompting a couple of passengers nearby to glance up. He gave a polite nod and stepped into the aisle, brushing lightly past the woman just as she began moving toward the galley. Her eyes flicked toward him again. There was no panic in them, only cold calculation. The man in the cap reached the back, then suddenly ducked into the space beside the galley door. Not into the lavatory, but behind the curtain near the storage cabinets. A restricted area. Marcus, the junior flight attendant, noticed and began to approach. But Ibrahim subtly held up a hand and gave a tiny shake of his head. Marcus froze, confused but obedient. He backed away. Ibrahim moved toward the back of the plane. Every step was measured. He could feel eyes on him now, some curious, some afraid, some watching for a signal. The tension was suffocating, like walking a tightrope in a storm. Then the cabin lights flickered. Once. A low hum filled the air, barely audible but distinct. The passengers looked around, concerned. In the cockpit, the co-pilot gasped. Electrical interference. The captain's hands tightened on the controls. Someone's transmitting from inside the plane. Claude didn't wait. He turned and bolted for the cabin, opening the secure crew comms. We need ground intervention ready. Secure the airfield. Emergency code level 3. Repeat. Level 3. But on the ground something else was happening. The airfield they were being rerouted to wasn't a commercial airport. It was a private strip known for quiet arrivals. The kind used for discreet diplomatic meetings. Or covert transfers. The staff on the ground were ready. But it wasn't clear who had sent the orders. And who would be waiting when they landed. Back on the plane, the woman with the purse reached into the side compartment and pulled out a folded cloth. Inside something small and metallic. Hidden well. She didn't raise it, not yet. But she held it tightly, tucked against her side as she walked. Ibrahim had only seconds. He turned to face the back of the cabin, standing between the galley and the last row. His voice, calm and low, reached the ears of only a few nearby. Ladies and gentlemen, I need you to stay seated. And I need you to trust me. The words rippled. Some passengers froze. Others whispered. No one moved. The woman took another step forward. The man in the cap peeked around the corner. Ibrahim's hand slowly slid into his jacket, not for a weapon, but for the letter with the seal. If anything happened next, this letter had to make it off the plane. He looked for someone, anyone he could trust. And that's when Kofi, the teenage boy, stood up. Eyes wide, hands trembling, he held up his phone. "I saw her. She dropped something near seat 9C. I think she did something." The woman froze. All eyes turned. And the plane, still gliding smoothly through the sky, became a pressurized box of pure silence, seconds away from something no one could predict. The climax was near. But the truth hadn't yet revealed itself. The boy's voice echoed louder than expected in the tense silence. "She dropped something near seat 9C, Kofi repeated, his hand shaking as he held up his phone. For a moment, nobody moved, everyone frozen between disbelief and fear. The woman paused mid-step, her calm exterior cracking ever so slightly. She didn't speak, didn't deny it. Instead, her fingers tightened around the cloth in her hand, her body subtly shifting like someone preparing to act. Ibrahim's eyes narrowed. That single gesture, the shift in her stance, told him she was trained. Whoever she was, this wasn't her first mission. But what was unexpected was the boy. Kofi, a teenager who should have been invisible on this flight, had just altered the entire dynamic. Now the would-be threat knew someone was watching her beyond Ibrahim. And for a second she hesitated. The moment broke. The man in the cap moved first, stepping quickly out from behind the galley curtain. Not toward Ibrahim but toward the front of the plane. That caught Ibrahim off guard. His instincts had been bracing for a confrontation at the rear, but now the threat was splitting. Two targets, two directions. Something else was in motion. That's when Marcus, still lingering by the crew area, made a move of his own. He reached into the service cabinet and pulled out a secured first aid pouch, but not for medical supplies. Taped underneath the lining, hidden from view, was a secure transponder, an emergency beacon issued by the airline only in the rarest of crisis-level scenarios. He pressed it twice, triggering a silent alert to aviation security. It would take minutes to register on the ground, but once it did, they'd know something was deeply wrong on board. Meanwhile, Kofi's mother had pulled him back into his seat, arms protectively around him, her eyes darting between Ibrahim and the woman. Tension in the cabin climbed higher as more passengers realized this wasn't a normal disturbance. Whispers turned into panicked murmurs. Several began fumbling with their phones, trying to connect despite the Wi-Fi blackout. Ibrahim raised his voice just enough to reach the middle rows. "Everyone stay calm. Remain seated. We are handling the situation." His tone was controlled even. It was the voice of a leader, not yelling but commanding. That's when the second plot twist hit. A voice came from the intercom. But it wasn't the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice said with a steady accent, "this is your new pilot speaking. Please remain seated for your safety. All changes have been authorized." Everyone froze. Even the crew. It wasn't the captain's voice. And it wasn't coming from the cockpit. Ibrahim's heart dropped. Whoever had boarded this flight wasn't just a small team trying to make a statement. They had accessed internal systems. The speaker system was only accessible through a crew panel or with a bypass code. Someone had planted a second system or overridden the flight's comms. This wasn't just surveillance. It was a coordinated operation. Claude burst from the cockpit seconds later, his face ghost white. "Captain's still in the seat," he whispered to Ibrahim. That wasn't him. Panic spread. Passengers were starting to rise despite orders. Some cried. Others shouted. The flight attendants tried to calm them, but the atmosphere had already spiraled. A few people toward the rear clutched their bags instinctively, eyes wide. The aircraft, though flying steady, now felt like a trap. Ibrahim turned to Claude, voice low but urgent. "Do you have access to the alternate security panel?" Claude nodded, breathing hard. "Behind the coffee unit. Manual lock override. We've never had to use it." "Use it now," Ibrahim said. "Lock down all entry to the cockpit and galley. No one moves without your clearance." Claude moved fast. Meanwhile, the man in the cap had reached the front. But instead of making an aggressive move, He opened the overhead compartment. And that's when another twist hit. Inside, taped to the lining, was a small black box. Compact, blinking faintly. Not a bomb. Not a weapon. A signal disruptor. They weren't just watching. They were cutting the plane off from ground contact, radar, and emergency frequencies. It explained the interference. It explained the delayed response from ground command. And it meant only one thing. They had prepared for every possibility. Ibrahim knew this wasn't about harming the passengers. Not yet. It was about removing him without resistance. No guns. No threats. Just isolation, manipulation, and control. The woman, the man in the cap, even the fake cockpit voice, they were part of a psychological strategy. Disorient the passengers. Take over the narrative. Force him to make a move. Or force others to turn on him. But what they hadn't counted on was someone recognizing him. Kofi. A child's eyes had shattered their silent plan. Now, passengers were choosing sides. Not intentionally, but out of fear. Some began to question Ibrahim, asking who he really was. Others asked the flight attendants what was happening. One man in the back shouted, "Why is that kid saying people are planting things? Why is the president even on this flight? What aren't you telling us?" The division was spreading and fast. Ibrahim stood tall, eyes sweeping across the rows. "I am Ibrahim Traoré," he said firmly. His voice carrying across the cabin. "President of Burkina Faso. I boarded this flight quietly to attend a meeting that concerns peace and cooperation in Africa. But someone does not want that meeting to happen. Someone wants to stop this plane, not with violence, but with confusion." He let the silence settle. "Stay calm. Watch your surroundings. Don't assume the worst of your neighbor. And trust that we will get through this. Together." Some passengers nodded slowly. Others still looked unsure. But the woman with the cloth didn't wait for a response. She turned and moved toward the galley. Ibrahim followed her with his eyes, but didn't stop her yet. He needed to know where she was going. What she planned next. As she disappeared behind the curtain, another beep echoed through the cabin. This time from the crew's secured panel. Claude looked down, then up at Ibrahim. "Security breach. Rear service door just attempted a manual override." That made no sense. The service door couldn't open at this altitude. Unless someone had tampered with the internal pressure locks. A horrifying thought hit him. This wasn't just a threat to extract him. It might be a diversion for something far worse. A false hijack, to crash the flight and make it look like an accident. Ibrahim's pulse surged. He turned back toward the galley. But she was gone. And so was the man in the cap. 2 agents. 1 disruptor. Compromised system. And the plane now just minutes from descent into an unknown airfield. One no longer confirmed to be safe. The sky outside remained beautiful. But inside the clock was ticking. And the real plan had just begun. Ibrahim rushed toward the galley. His breath steady but his heart racing. The curtain was swaying as if someone had just slipped through. He pulled it back quickly. Nothing but coffee carts and trays. But then he saw the narrow panel near the emergency exit, slightly ajar. A flicker of movement. The woman had found the pressure valve control, likely hidden from standard crew view, and she was tampering with it. "Stop," Ibrahim said firmly. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. The cloth in her hand was now gone. In its place was a tool, nothing deadly, but enough to disable the pressure lock. She wasn't trying to open the door in midair. She was preparing it to be opened safely once the aircraft dropped low enough for extraction. "This doesn't have to end badly," she said calmly. "You weren't supposed to notice. But since you did, we can offer you an alternative." Ibrahim took 1 step closer, not aggressive but confident. "You've compromised the flight, the communication, and the crew. And now you want me to leave with you." "Voluntarily," she replied. "We don't want blood. Just silence. The summit you're attending. Too many people stand to lose if you speak." Ibrahim shook his head slowly. That's exactly why I must. In that moment, from the main cabin, a shout erupted. Kofi! Where are you? It was his mother. Her voice was panicked, loud. Ibrahim's eyes widened. He moved past the woman, pushed back into the cabin, and saw it. Kofi's seat was empty. People were standing, looking around. One of the passengers shouted. He went toward the front, with the man in the hat. A chill swept through the plane. Ibrahim scanned the aisle, eyes locking onto the front of the aircraft where the curtain to the forward galley was now drawn shut. Iran. Passengers cleared the aisle as Ibrahim pushed forward. Claude was already moving from the cockpit side, coming from the opposite direction. The two met just feet away from the sealed curtain. He took the boy, Claude gasped. He has him. Ibrahim's voice lowered. They're trying to use him. They think it'll stop me. He reached slowly for the side cabinet near the galley door and found what he hoped would still be there. A crew emergency flashlight. He snapped it on and gave Claude a quick nod. We open together, Ibrahim said. Claude yanked the curtain back. There stood the man in the cap, now without the cap, his hand gripping Kofi's shoulder. The boy looked terrified, frozen, his lips trembling. But the man didn't look panicked. He looked determined. Back off, the man said. He's just a passenger. You come any closer, and I'll open the galley door once we hit descent. Nobody walks away. You don't want to hurt him, Ibrahim said evenly, keeping his voice calm but steady. You came for me. You're using a child. That tells me you've already lost. The man's jaw tightened. You think this ends with you walking out at that summit. You've made enemies beyond borders, President. And yet, Ibrahim said softly, you're the one standing here, holding a child between us. The flashlight in his hand flicked up, not into the man's eyes, but into the overhead sensor, triggering a silent alert known only to trained security personnel. Claude, recognizing the code, slipped away quietly. Help would be ready when they landed. Now it was just them. The man's grip faltered. Kofi took the chance. He ducked under the man's arm and ran. That one move changed everything. Ibrahim lunged forward, slamming his shoulder into the man, pinning him to the galley wall. The two struggled in a tight space, neither one with room to swing. But Ibrahim's training took over. He locked the man's arm behind him, twisting until the tool he held dropped to the floor. Claude returned with two other attendants, securing the man's wrists with flex ties meant for unruly passengers. The threat was over, or so it seemed. As Ibrahim caught his breath, passengers began clapping, first softly, then louder. People rose from their seats, eyes full of respect, relief, and awe. Some had tears in their eyes. Kofi ran into his mother's arms, clinging tightly. The crew began restoring order, assuring everyone the flight was safe. Then the cockpit called out, Mr. Traoré, you're going to want to hear this. Ibrahim stepped inside. The captain pointed at the radar. We're 10 minutes from landing. But there's a new update. Your security team was never told about the airstrip we were rerouted to. Someone else authorized the diversion. Ibrahim frowned. So we're still compromised. Yes, the captain said grimly. Unless we change course again right now. Ibrahim looked at the map. There was another strip, military-controlled 20 miles east. Trusted ground. Divert us, he said. Now. As the plane veered slightly, a wave of tension passed again, but this time it was met with resolve. Back in the cabin, the woman had been detained quietly. She said nothing, just stared ahead with a blank expression. The man, cuffed and bruised, sat at the rear, guarded. The passengers watched them in silence, some still processing everything that had happened. Minutes later, the wheels touched down. On the tarmac, security vehicles lined the runway. Soldiers surrounded the aircraft. As the door opened and the stairs rolled forward, Ibrahim stepped out, sunlight striking his face. He was calm, composed, determined. Then a final voice called out behind him. Sir, said one of the ground officers, handing him a sealed folder. This was found in the cargo hold. Diplomatic crate. Not on the manifest. Ibrahim opened it. Inside was a set of forged travel documents. His face. Different name. And a plane ticket scheduled to leave within the hour. For a country known to shelter political dissidents. Second plan. They had not only tried to remove him, they were going to replace him. The real plan wasn't to silence him in the sky. It was to erase him completely, without anyone even realizing he had disappeared. And as Ibrahim stared at the false identity, he realized something deeper. The flight wasn't just about stopping a summit. It was about rewriting the future of Africa. From the shadows. And this was only the beginning. Ibrahim stared at the forged documents, the weight of what had almost happened settling deep in his chest. The details were chilling. His name replaced with a fabricated identity, the passport crafted with near-perfect precision, and a boarding pass booked for a private flight hours later. The plan had been disturbingly thorough. If the plot had succeeded, he wouldn't have just gone missing. He would have been officially seen leaving for a different country under a false name. A quiet disappearance, disguised by bureaucracy. He handed the folder back to the officer. His voice low but steady. "Secure this, and make sure my delegation knows everything. No part of this story stays hidden." The officer nodded, already stepping away to relay the orders. Nearby, Kofi stood with his mother, still shaken but unharmed. Ibrahim walked over, crouched to the boy's level, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You saw what others didn't," he said softly. "You spoke up when it mattered." Kofi nodded, his eyes wide. "I didn't know who you were. I just felt something wasn't right." Ibrahim smiled. "That's exactly what a good leader does. Speaks when others stay silent, even if it's scary." The boy's mother thanked him, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved everyone. Thank you, Mr. President." Ibrahim gently corrected her. "We saved each other." As ground crews led passengers off the plane, media had already begun to arrive beyond the perimeter, cameras clicking, microphones thrust forward. Word had leaked, intentionally or not, that a possible hijack had been thwarted mid-air, and that a high-profile African leader had been at the center of it. For a moment, Ibrahim stood at the top of the mobile stairs, looking over the field. His mind wandered to the summit he was now late for, the Allies waiting for him, and the enemies still hiding in plain sight. This wasn't just about one flight. It was about the kind of world leaders like him were trying to build. A world where African voices could lead their own future without being silenced from the outside. He descended the steps. Later that evening, in a secured government compound, Ibrahim met with his core team. Intelligence had already begun identifying the source of the forged documents and the intercepted orders that had diverted the plane. Several of the individuals responsible for organizing the operation had ties to foreign lobbying interests, groups that saw Ibrahim's rising influence in West Africa as a threat to their control over regional resources and politics. "We've uncovered evidence," his security chief reported, "that this wasn't just about stopping you from reaching the summit. They wanted to discredit the movement entirely. Frame you, claim you fled, and leave the talks leaderless." Ibrahim leaned forward. They wanted to kill more than just a man. They wanted to kill hope. That night the summit still took place, delayed but not deterred. Ibrahim arrived under increased protection, but he insisted on addressing the assembly himself. The room, filled with African leaders, activists, and regional delegates, stood in silence as he entered. Then, slowly they applauded. Not just for him but for what he represented. He walked to the podium, no prepared speech in hand, only the weight of the truth and the clarity of near death. "They tried to silence us before we could speak. They tried to change the story before it was even written," he began. "But I stand before you today as proof that we are not so easily erased. That the vision we share for this continent, unity, strength, and dignity, cannot be rewritten from the shadows." His voice didn't rise with anger, carried with conviction. "We have work to do. We must protect our leaders, not just with guards, but with systems that keep our movements transparent and accountable. We must educate our people to see beyond distractions and manipulation. And we must remember that real power doesn't lie in silence or control. It lies in the voices of those who speak truth. The room stood in ovation. Back at the airport, the detained woman and her accomplice were transferred to international authorities. Both refused to speak beyond confirming false identities. It became clear they were not acting for any official government, but for a hidden syndicate, one that worked across borders, seeking to destabilize rising African leaders who rejected foreign control. Ibrahim's intelligence team continued digging, uncovering trails that led to offshore accounts, lobbyist-funded think tanks, and private firms once thought untouchable. But justice, in its quiet way, had begun to move. Kofi's story made headlines across Africa. The boy who spoke up on the plane became a symbol of courage, proof that awareness and bravery didn't require power or titles. Ibrahim later invited him and his mother to the presidential residence, presenting Kofi with a medal for civilian courage. It was a simple gesture, but one that reminded everyone watching that heroes are often the ones least expected. As days passed, the story of the flight faded from global headlines, but in Burkina Faso and across much of West Africa, it remained a turning point. A reminder of what could have been lost, and what was still possible to build. Ibrahim returned to his daily work with deeper focus. He strengthened transparency laws, increased cybersecurity around travel protocols. He met with other African heads of state to form a confidential coalition, committed to protecting democratic movements from silent interference. Behind closed doors, they called it the Horizon Pact, a united effort to shield emerging African leadership from the ghosts of colonial influence and manipulation. But Ibrahim never changed how he traveled. He still walked among people, still boarded commercial flights when necessary, still refused to wrap himself in walls and silence. When asked why, he gave a simple answer. Because fear should never be stronger than the people we serve. And so, the man who had once been dismissed by a flight attendant, who sat unnoticed in row 3, continued forward, not as a figure of power, but as a symbol of humility and strength. The attempted erasure only made his presence stronger. And for those who had tried to silence him, the real twist wasn't the failure of their plan. It was the fact that the very flight meant to destroy him had turned into the flight that reminded millions why his voice mattered. And that was something no plot could take away.